A Wild West performer lies dead on his kitchen floor.
911, what is your emergency? I need an ambulance real fast. There's blood all over.
There were 8 entrance wounds, 4 in the head, 3 in the upper chest. He was dressed as a cowboy, dressed all in black, from his boots to his hat. He was known by Black Bart.
His grieving widow has a colorful past.
She was one of Hugh Hefner's first Playboy bunnies.
She taught Catholic school by day and Playboy bunny by night. She had a double life.
The investigation into her husband's murder reveals they had plenty of enemies.
They would do gunfight shows on property on the weekends.
I did ask him if he ever had his ass kicked, and I offered to do it.
Her husband didn't know about it, and she didn't want him to know about it.
The question is, which of their foes killed Black Bart?
His attitude, I have said, someday somebody is going to shoot him.
It just eventually led into, yeah, we'd like to see him dead.
There's nothing worse than being betrayed by a loved one, and that's what it was.
Desert nights outside Phoenix, Arizona are normally quiet and peaceful. But at 10:30 p.m. on October 20th, 1992, a resident in an upscale neighborhood comes home to violence.
911, what is your emergency? Yeah, my name is Carole Gold. I need an ambulance real fast. My husband's on the kitchen floor. There's blood all over. I think he's dead.
Officers get to the scene, and the woman who called Carole Gold, she leads them inside the house, and they find her husband on the ground.
He was dressed as a cowboy, all in black, from his boots to his hat. It kind of jumped out at you. And he had a Western-style belt with a big buckle on it that said Black Bart on it. The victim was identified by his wife, Carole. He was known by either Chuck or Black Bart.
After securing the crime scene, Phoenix police officers notify the homicide division. The first detective on the scene is Joseph Petrosino.
When I got there really wasn't a lot of blood. There were 8 entrance wounds, 4 in the head, 3 in the upper chest, and 1 which was through the wrist. One of the wounds is behind the ear. I suspect that would have been one where he was down on the floor, and it's just, we're just going to make sure that he doesn't get up off the floor, execution style.
As Detective Petrosino moves into the living room, he notices a strange detail.
I had a chair in the living room, and I can see that the chair has been moved, and I can see that something had been behind the chair, which appeared to be shoe prints. And it's right close to the entrance to the kitchen, so that if you came around that corner, you would have immediately been able to see who's in the kitchen. I suspect that once he went into the room, he was confronted almost immediately, and the shooting began.
It seemed it could have been the robbery gone wrong. The robber broke in, and then Chuck scared him.
He died the way a lot of Old West criminals died, gunned down. He was ambushed.
They're looking at the crime scene, trying to figure out footprints, fingerprints, anything that was left behind. So you're left with all these questions. Was this somebody that broke in? Was this a targeted attack on Chuck Gold's life?
Chuck Gold was born in March 1941 and grew up in Illinois as one of 4 boys in a close-knit family.
He grew up in an area of Chicago called Rogers Park, and with very loving and doting parents. They were very good, close brothers. They were raised in a kosher home in a nice Jewish neighborhood.
Growing up, he was very much interested in the West, in the cowboys. He rode horses a lot, every chance he had, and worked pretty close with them.
What kid of the 40s and 50s wasn't drawn to gunfights and cowboys?
As a teenager, Chuck traded his Western wear for an army uniform, serving several years in Germany.
He joined before he graduated high school. I've been told he did cross paths with Elvis around the time that Elvis actually was leaving the army. My dad was out in 61, I believe. My parents met shortly after.
Chuck met his first wife in 1961. The two married soon after and had one daughter, Stephanie.
My mom was young. They separated when I was 9 months old, and they were divorced by the time I was 2. After that, my father was married 5 times. My mother was his first wife. So I didn't know 2 and 3 at all. 4, I knew because she was the mother of my half-sister. But no relationships whatsoever with any of them.
Though Chuck's marriages didn't last, his love of the Wild West stayed true. He turned that passion into a career, managing horse stables near Chicago and putting on gunslinger exhibitions with staged battles, fashioning himself after the famous outlaw, Black Bart.
They got a stagecoach and they got horses, and they would do gunfight shows on property on the weekends.
In 1977, after 16 years working the Western show circuit, 36-year-old Chuck met the woman who would become his 5th wife, Carole Catini.
Carole was always into horses. Where Dad and Carole met was at a horse show.
She actually worked in the Playboy gift shop in Lake Geneva, and then she went and worked in the stables in the Lake Geneva Club.
Carole had a 20-year history with the Playboy organization, starting with its first club in Chicago.
They opened the first club in 1960, and they needed bunnies, and Carole was one of the first rounds of girls hired. She was an original bunny.
Carole was trying to get a teaching degree. She wound up teaching at a Catholic school. Her joke was she taught Catholic school by day and Playboy bunny by night. So she had a double life.
By the time she met Chuck at a horse show, Carole had traded in her bunny ears for motherhood. She had 2 children from a previous marriage, including a son named Ashton. After a whirlwind romance, she and Chuck tied the knot and decided to open horse stables of their own.
They were doing very well. Lake Geneva, in the summer months, Lake Geneva, my Lord, it was a very busy town, and they did a big business.
Carole also supported Chuck in reuniting with his estranged daughter.
My dad was not part of my life when I was a child growing up. When I first reestablished my relationship with my father, they were running the stables at the Playboy Club in Lake Geneva. Carole was very open, very loving, very accepting, very sweet. I also met Ashton. He wasn't quite 10 yet, so he was this 9-year-old little kid. I said, "Do you mind having an older sister?" So they became my other family.
The Playboy Club closed in 1983, which put an end to Chuck and Carole's business as well. So they started over again in Phoenix, leasing stables at the upscale Hilton Resort.
The stable did tremendously well financially. Man, they were the single most financially successful stable of any of the valley back then.
I was 21 years old. My vacations were all in Arizona. I wound up working at the stables, and I did all of that with Carole. So my relationship was, she was my other mother. I called her Mom. The dynamic between my father and Carole was amazing. Carole ran the stables, kept the books, and my father did the gunfight shows. He would go play and be Black Bart and drive the stagecoach. Whenever he was at the stables, he was always dressed as Black Bart. He was very happy.
Now, the man who spent years staging fake gunfights seems to have become the victim of a real one in his own kitchen.
Carole Gold is the one that made the 911 call, and immediately officers and detectives need to ask her questions about Chuck. Did he have enemies? Was somebody possibly out to get him? Based on everything they learned, they start thinking, well, maybe we do need to look more into the family. Maybe there was a little more there than people were letting on.
Coming up, evidence suggests the crime scene isn't what it appears to be.
The scene didn't look like a robbery.
And an old grudge lends the investigation a suspect.
We had words, argument kinda, and trying to explain my side, he didn't want to hear about it.
Detectives are less than 2 hours into the investigation of the death of Chuck Gold. Before questioning his widow, police collect evidence at the crime scene.
We recovered 8 spent .22 caliber shell casings scattered about the kitchen.
There are 2 guns found in the kitchen, a .32 caliber pistol in a bag on the countertop, and a .22 attached to Chuck's belt buckle. The weapons don't appear to have been fired, suggesting to police the shooter had caught Chuck by surprise with their own .22 caliber weapon.
We also found the back door was not locked. That meant either somebody went out the door before I got there and unlocked the door and left it, or the door hadn't been locked in the first place.
How could this be a robbery when it seems so personal?
With no signs of a break-in, a botched robbery seems unlikely.
We never found a wallet, but as you go from room to room and look at stuff, there's nothing disturbed. Nobody's pulled out drawers and thrown stuff around. So somebody that's in there isn't looking for anything. The scene didn't look like a robbery.
With no evidence of a burglary, detectives surmise this was likely a targeted execution. While Detective Petrosino continues searching for clues, his partner Ed Reynolds questions Carole Gold.
She basically says they fight like normal people do, but in general, it's just a real good relationship. They had been married for 14 years.
Carole tells police that she had been working at the stables all day, started early in the morning, got off later, and then decided to go have dinner with her daughter from a previous marriage. It's at 10:30 that she arrives back at home, and that's when she tells detectives she found Chuck.
Carole's alibi should be easy enough to check out, but Detective Reynolds is also interested to know if she has any possible motive.
He asks about life insurance. In this particular case, Carole says that there is no big policy to her knowledge. Another area that gets touched on during that initial interview is fidelity. Is there any possibility that Chuck's got a girlfriend?
Carole tells officers that, yes, Chuck had had girlfriends in the past while they were married. She knew about it, but said it had been years since that had happened.
According to Carole, Chuck only had one enemy she knows of.
She tells police that they did have a former employee who did not get along with Chuck. His name was James Long Jr., and he went by Jimbo.
It's the guy that shoes the horses. And at And at some point after he's there, some materials get stolen from Chuck. A saddle, some guns.
Jimbo was fired because of this, but there had been some rumors among the employees at the horse stables that Jimbo wanted to get back at Chuck.
He'd made some threats, and the debate is were they threats or were he just, shooting his mouth off?
Before they follow up on the lead, they want to speak with Carole's 20-year-old son, Ashton, who also lives in the house.
He'd been paged that something happened to Chuck. He immediately came home and met up with the family, his sister, his mother. Ed talks to Ashton about, what's the deal between you and Chuck? How do you get along?
Ashton tells investigators that his dad had passed away years earlier when he was 4. So most of his life, it was Chuck Gold that had raised him. He'd refer to him as his dad, not his stepdad.
Ashton admits he hasn't always been the ideal stepson.
Ashton admits to the fact that he was on probation for a drug issue. But since he had been on probation, he had really gotten his life together and he was working, and there hadn't been any issues since.
Ashton says he's been working as a driver at the stables, and he agrees with his mother. If anyone wanted to hurt Chuck, it was Jimbo.
Ashton goes into a little more on Jimbo's criminal history, that he'd made some statements about he was going to take care of Chuck. So we now know Jimbo was a possible suspect. We're going to have to track down Jimbo.
Carole Gold and her son, Ashton Catini, have just given detectives a possible lead: Chuck Gold's blacksmith, Jimbo. But before detectives move on to Jimbo, Ashton offers one last insight into Carole and Chuck's relationship.
They asked Ashton, Chuck got a girlfriend? And he goes, yeah, her name's Germaine. She's married. He's seen them together at the stable, but when there are other people around, they don't act like boyfriend and girlfriend, but everybody knew about it. Ashton mentions the fact that his mother doesn't seem to be upset by the girlfriend.
But Carole is telling detectives that Chuck hasn't had any girlfriends for at least a year. So that's definitely a break in what Carole knew to be true.
Now, we have to talk to Jimbo, and we have to find Germaine and see what she's got to say.
Investigators track down Jimbo the next day and question him about the allegations that he stole 2 of Chuck's pistols.
Chuck did try to accuse me of taking the guns. I told him that I didn't take them. It could have been a variety of people, but there was only 2 people with keys to that room. It was Chuck and Carole, and Ashton had access to either one of the sets of keys. I think I got arrested, and I was in jail for 3 days and got out, and there was no charges brought against me after that. They didn't have no evidence that I did it.
Jimbo had a temper, too. I know a couple of times I talked to him, he was not happy at all that Chuck fired him.
Jimbo admits he was angry at Chuck, but says he would never seek revenge.
When I met with Chuck, we had words, or argument kinda, and trying to explain my side. He didn't want to hear, Chuck didn't want to hear my side. There was never no threats. I did ask him if he ever had his ass kicked, and I offered to do it. After all the squabble over all of that, me and Chuck ended up getting along again. It just, well, what would you call it? That bygones be bygones.
But according to Jimbo, there were any number of other people who didn't feel the same way.
Chuck's attitude, the way he went around people, just the lifestyle he lived of being a gunslinger, Black Bart, I have said, someday somebody is going to shoot him. Chuck didn't have a problem of telling people off, not saying I wished it up on him or nothing, but there's a lot of people dislike Chuck.
Other things that Jimbo responds to, he's able to verify that Jermaine and Chuck have some type of a relationship because he's seen Chuck kiss her at the stable.
Detectives also confirm that Jimbo was miles away at the time they believe the shooting took place.
I couldn't have done it. I was at Dynamite Arena from like 5 o'clock that evening until about 11 o'clock that night. Never left the premises.
He was in a public place. He's really got a good alibi. Following the interview, we go down the list, all the things that Carole and Ashton told us that we have been able to verify were untrue to some extent or another. So at this point in time, you have to go back and look at Ashton and Carole as being primarily suspects. The other investigative lead would be Jermaine. We have to track down Jermaine and find out what her situation is.
Coming up, investigators discover the cracks in a seemingly happy marriage.
She says that at one point Carole told Chuck she didn't want to have sex with him anymore.
And a son's secret comes to light.
Apparently he'd owed some drug dealers some money.
Following the interview with Chuck's former enemy, Jimbo, detectives tracked down Chuck's alleged girlfriend, Jermaine, to confirm there was an ongoing affair.
On the 27th of October, they had an interview similar to the one they had with Jimbo. She eventually verifies the fact that she and Chuck did have a sexual relationship, that her husband didn't know about it, and she didn't want him to know about it. They'd known each other since her son had taken riding lessons. They socialized, the four of them, she and her husband, Chuck and Carole.
Jermaine tells police the main issue she knows about between Carole and Chuck is their sexual relationship. She says that at one point Carole told Chuck she didn't want to have sex with him anymore, and so that became almost platonic.
According to Jermaine, she and her husband were together the night of the murder. Detectives follow up on her alibi and are able to rule her out as a suspect. Investigators ask her when she last spoke to Chuck. Her answer seems to shockingly cast suspicion on his stepson, Ashton.
Chuck had called her just prior to the day of the incident and was angry, complaining about Ashton. The fact that Ashton is not carrying his part of the load. He's not working. He's a financial drain.
Jermaine says she doesn't have the details, but knows someone who might.
She told Ed that he needed to get with Richard Feingold, who is Chuck's right-hand man at the stable. He would know the ins and outs, the day-to-day of the stable, and he would be able to answer questions, reference the relationships between Chuck and Carole and Ashton, that kind of information. They head back out to the stables at the point and meet up with Richard Feingold.
He describes himself as this kind of best friend, confidant of Chuck Gold.
Richard says that Ashton is costing Chuck a lot of money for school that he's not going to, that he's got a criminal history that Chuck's trying to deal with.
I was at the stables quite often when Ashton would smoke pot at the stables. Chuck would catch him, and they didn't get along very well at all. Ashton smoking pot on the premises of the reserve is against the law, for one. They could have lost everything they had. Just the wrong person walking in at the wrong time. The resort would have canceled the contract.
Richard also tells police that at this time, Ashton had this long-term drug problem.
Apparently, he'd owed some drug dealers some money, and Carole and Chuck, quote, bailed him out.
Richard says the name of Ashton's main drug dealer is Bob.
Richard says Ashton's not a reformed drug user. He's still doing drugs. His stepfather has a problem with him, and they aren't working through it. They're at odds.
Carole would act as a mediator as best she could between the two, and if push come to shove, she would always stand up for her son, pretty much all the time.
Chuck had basically reached the end of his rope and wanted him out of the house. Richard says Chuck had given Carole an ultimatum. Ashton either goes or the both of you go. He told her that he had to be gone by October 31st. They could both go because he was going to divorce her.
This information comes as a shock to detectives because this is the first time they're hearing this. When they interviewed Carole and when they interviewed Ashton, none of this came up, and they both made it seem like things are pretty good between Chuck and Ashton.
Investigators discover Carole was also withholding information about something else.
There's an $150,000 life insurance policy on Chuck Gold, and Carole Gold is the main beneficiary.
Which goes back to, why is she telling the detective, I don't know anything about that insurance policy? That forces the needle from next of kin, grieving widow, to somebody that's lying to me. And I want to know why.
Coming up, will the true culprits face justice?
There was hope that my dad would get justice, that we would all be able to close that door.
And Ashton's dealer offers another side of the story.
I kept saying, I'm not the shooter. I'm not the shooter.
The revelations about Carole Gold and her son Ashton have put them in detectives' crosshairs. To find out why they've been lying, investigators bring Ashton in for another round of questioning and confront him about what they know.
Sometimes we lie to suspects. The story is that we have an anonymous informant that said that you stole the guns and gave them to Bob. And Ashton was dumbfounded that we had the name Bob.
Ashton came off very concerned about his probation to detectives and admitted he had been using drugs up until Chuck's death.
Ashton still denies knowing anything about Chuck's murder, but he tells investigators if they're looking for Bob, they'll find him at the fitness center where he works.
We reach out to the Drug Enforcement Unit, and they know who Bob is. His last name's Pryor. He's a known distributor of synthetic heroin.
Detectives learn Bob Pryor is out on bail after agents raided his home during a recent drug sting.
When they served the search warrant, they found a box of 22 Stingers, which is the brand of shell casings that we recovered from the crime scene. and he was known to be in possession or the owner of a Ruger 22 semi-automatic pistol. So at this point, we now have a lot of circumstantial evidence that ties Pryor to Ashton.
Because Bob Pryor was in possession of the same type of ammunition used to murder Chuck, police consider the possibility he was the one who pulled the trigger.
Bob could be the weak link. If we can get enough on Bob, he can flip on who paid him or who hired him or who convinced him to do it.
The drug unit involved in the raid informs detectives about an associate of Pryor's named Dan Goddard, a career criminal who is currently working for them as an informant. If Pryor was involved in Chuck's shooting, Goddard might know.
Goddard comes down for an interview because of his relationship with the police department. He's trying not to go back to prison. That's why he's working as an informant. And so they ask him about, what does he know about Pryor?
Investigators get far more out of Goddard than they hoped for. He claims Pryor hired him to be his driver the night of the murder.
He outlines the fact that he got a call from Pryor, who offered him $50 to drive him around, and he takes the money, and Pryor directs him as to where he wants to go. They do a drive-by on the house, and Pryor tells him to stop and let him out, tells him that he'll page him when he needs him to pick him up and where to pick him up at. Goddard's belief is that Pryor's probably gonna go and collect money that's owed to him. Goddard drives around waiting for the page, and he gets the page, he picks Pryor up, and then they drive to a location where there's a canal, and Pryor gets out.
The real aha moment is when Dan Goddard actually drives detectives to where he went that night, and it's Chuck Gold's house.
After the fact, he put together that Pryor most likely killed Chuck Gold and got rid of the gun by throwing it in the canal.
And immediately after that interview, Ashton jumps to the top of the list. Could this murder have been a motive of Ashton being angry at his stepdad for wanting to kick him out of the house? And was Carole covering for her son? Detectives are now putting these puzzle pieces together, that the two hired a hitman for the job.
Goddard's statement gives detectives probable cause to arrest Bob Pryor, Ashton Cattini, and Carole Gold.
There's a lot of circumstantial evidence that showed that Carole was involved. Now you got to prove it.
When Carole and Ashton were first arrested, I was crushed. I mean, I had already lost my father. Now I've lost my family. I've been betrayed.
Unfortunately, the DA doesn't think they have enough to charge Carole.
They booked Ashton for first-degree murder along with Pryor, but they let Carole go. And the prosecutor said, all we have is the word of a known drug dealer, criminal, and we don't have enough to tie her to it.
Carole gets with an attorney, and she's able to get the charges dropped after spending just a short amount of time in jail. Because she's released, she's able to cash in on that life insurance policy.
Carole ends up spending most of the six-figure payout on defense attorneys for her son.
It's December of 1994. Ashton and Bob are both on trial for first-degree murder and conspiracy.
When Ashton and I went to trial, they called Dan Goddard because he's the one that snitched, but he was also under snitch agreement and was supposed to have told on all this stuff before it had happened.
Dan Goddard was given immunity because he agreed to testify against them.
They kept coming to me, wanting me to confess to being the shooter, and they would give me a deal to testify. And I kept saying, I'm not the shooter. I'm not the shooter.
The defense that is put up is that Chuck was sick and was dying, and he hired a hitman, so that would be assisted suicide. 11 out of the 12 jurors rejected that and felt that they'd actually committed murder for hire. But one juror hung the jury, so a mistrial was declared.
I was numb. I mean, there's no other word to describe it. The thing that I took in stride was the fact that the state still planned on pursuing further charges and would try them again. So there was hope that my dad would get justice, that we would all be able to close that door.
Prosecutors are gearing up to retry Bob Pryor and Ashton Cattini for the murder of Chuck Gold. But Detective Ed Reynolds still believes Carole Gold also needs to be charged.
He obtained the original documentation from the insurance company on the insurance policy.
They actually bring in a handwriting expert to say, hey, does this signature look like Chuck's signature? Because they thought maybe it was forged or maybe there was some fraud there.
The insurance policy was drawn up and taken out by Carole, and she signed his name to it.
But investigators need more for the DA to charge her. Out on bond, awaiting his new trial, Bob Pryor is the one who delivers it.
Shortly after being released, Pryor got arrested again for selling drugs, and he made a deal with the prosecutor to testify against Carole and Ashton for a reduced sentence.
They asked me if I would take a plea. And I said, what are we getting in return? And he gave us Carole. I said, done.
One year after the shooting death of Black Bart, Bob Pryor sits down with investigators to give his version of events.
Ashton started telling me about how much he did not like his stepfather, Chuck. I just figured it was a rich kid complaining about a stepfather. But it just eventually led into, yeah, we'd like to see him dead. You know, he's been cheating on Carole. She wasn't young anymore. I guess she was one of Hugh Hefner's first Playboy bunnies, and she didn't have that to fall back on.
Did Ashton ever tell you anything to lead you to believe that his mom was involved in this too?
Yes.
What kind of stuff did he tell you?
That was her idea. She wanted it, she paid for it.
They offered me $20,000.
Ashton was young during this time. I just assumed that Carole was the one running everything. Carole had the ultimate plan. There was an event that Chuck was going to, and when it was over and then he could come home, all we had to do was be waiting and shoot Chuck.
But Bob alleges that it was actually Dan Goddard who played the role of Triggerman.
What happened on the night of the murder?
Down over there and came back. And then...
How many times did he shoot him?
He didn't say. He didn't. He said he couldn't do it. I remember. He just said he just kept pulling the trigger.
When they told me what Dan Goddard said, what Dan did was he told the story and just switched the roles of me and him. And so I was like, oh hell no, this isn't the way it went.
Regardless of which man actually pulled the trigger, Bob's statement finally gives investigators enough evidence to arrest Carole. They charge her with first-degree murder and conspiracy, but she maintains her innocence.
I can't talk to you.
Can you take the heat off of your son?
I can't.
You can't even do that?
No, I won't do that right now.
Both mother and son are tried together on August 5th, 1997, nearly 5 years after Chuck's death.
When I was brought in to testify at their trial, that's when Ashton realized he hasn't got a prayer.
Mid-trial, Ashton decides he wants to take a plea deal and gets 18 years in prison.
Carole, however, proceeds to trial.
Carole is eventually found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy in the death of her husband, Chuck Gold.
She was sentenced to 25 years to life with the possibility of parole after 25.
I think that Carole and Ashton got exactly what they deserved. Carole is the worst kind of mother there is. Evil, lying. Carole didn't pull the trigger, but she is just as responsible. There's nothing worse than being betrayed by a loved one.
I think that Chuck should be remembered as having fulfilled his dream. He died a cowboy.
His headstone says Charles Black Bart Gold. His parents approved that. I can't imagine anything else explaining more who he was.
The headline didn't make sense at first. A cold case. California. 1998. A quarter of a century buried under dust, silence, and forgotten evidence suddenly breathing again. A DNA match. One line in a lab report, cold and clinical, cutting through 25 years of nothing. And just like that, the past wasn't past anymore. It began on a night so ordinary it barely deserved memory. Late August heat pressed against the windows of a quiet suburban street outside Sacramento. The air felt thick, unmoving, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Porch lights glowed soft yellow. Sprinklers ticked rhythmically across trimmed lawns. Somewhere in the distance, a television flickered behind drawn curtains. Inside one of those houses, everything looked exactly as it should. Too exactly. Her room was neat, not forced, not staged, just untouched. A paperback novel lay open on the bed, spine slightly bent, a page marked mid-sentence. A glass of water rested on the nightstand, still half full. Clothes folded, shoes aligned. The small, quiet details of a life paused, not ended. She was last seen at 9:17 p.m. That time would become a fixed point, anchored, repeated, studied, obsessively replayed in interviews, reports, and memories that refused to stay still. 9:17 p.m., the last moment the world still made sense. A neighbor later said they heard a car door close. Another claimed they saw movement near the sidewalk, just a shape, nothing more. A passing shadow. Someone else recalled a voice, faint, maybe calling out, maybe not. Every detail uncertain. Every memory unreliable. But together, they formed something worse than silence. They formed doubt. By morning, she was gone. No broken windows. No forced entry. No signs of struggle. The house didn't scream crime. It whispered confusion. The kind of quiet that feels wrong without explaining why. Police arrived fast. Faster than most cases. Missing persons always begin with urgency. Every minute counts. Every second stretches the distance between evidence and disappearance. They searched the house first. Methodical, room by room. Drawers opened. Closets inspected. Nothing out of place. Nothing disturbed. It was as if she had simply stepped out.
But people don't vanish like that.
Not without leaving something behind. Outside, the search expanded. Flashlights cut through the fading night. Officers walked the perimeter, scanning grass, fences, shadows. Her name echoed into the darkness again and again, each call thinner than the last. No answer. By sunrise, the neighborhood had changed. Doors closed tighter. Conversations lowered. The ordinary rhythm of life fractured, replaced by something sharper, colder. Fear moved in quietly, settling between houses, creeping through routines. Missing girl.
No suspects. No explanation.
Investigators began the interviews immediately. Family first, then friends, neighbors, teachers, anyone connected, no matter how loosely. Every word documented, every pause noted, every contradiction pulled apart. But the story refused to align. No clear timeline beyond that final moment. No one who saw enough. No one who knew what mattered. Leads emerged quickly, then collapsed just as fast. A car reported near the corner, unregistered, untraceable. A man walking past the house, never identified. A phone call that rang once, then stopped, origin unknown. Fragments. Disconnected. Useless. Days turned into weeks. The search intensified before it began to thin. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning open land beyond the neighborhood. Volunteers spread out in organized lines, sweeping fields inch by inch. Dogs followed faint trails that disappeared into nothing. Still nothing. No body.
No clothing. No trace.
And without a body, the case slipped into uncertainty. Not officially. Not yet. But subtly, undeniably. The urgency began to fade, replaced by repetition. Investigators revisited the same leads, the same people, the same dead ends. Speculation filled the gaps. Runaway. Abduction. Someone she knew. Someone she trusted. Each theory offered a possibility and dismantled another. The case grew heavier with time. Not solved. Not closed. Just stuck. Suspended between what happened and what could be proven. A question with no answer, echoing endlessly. Years passed. The house changed hands. New families moved in, unaware of the history beneath their feet. Fresh paint covered old walls. New furniture replaced what once belonged to a life interrupted. The street moved on. It had to. But the file didn't. It remained.
Thick.
Expanding. A growing archive of frustration. Photographs. Statements. Maps. Evidence logs. Each document another attempt to impose order on something that refused it. Every few years, a new detective would take a look. Fresh perspective. Renewed determination. They would start at the beginning. Always the beginning. 9:17 p.m. They would retrace the steps, re-interview the witnesses, re-examine the evidence, and every time they would arrive at the same conclusion. There wasn't enough. Not enough to accuse, not enough to charge, not enough to close the case. So it stayed open. A cold case. A phrase that sounds clinical, detached, but carries weight. It means time has passed. Leads have dried. Hope has thinned. It means the truth is still out there, but buried under years of silence. And then, slowly, quietly, something changed. Technology moved forward. DNA analysis, once limited, uncertain, became precise, powerful, capable of extracting meaning from the smallest fragments. Back in 1998, they had collected what they could. Standard procedure.
Swabs.
Samples. Anything that might hold value later. At the time, it didn't. The tools weren't advanced enough. The results inconclusive. So the evidence was stored, labeled, filed away, waiting. Years later, that waiting ended. The case was reopened, not because of a witness, not because of a confession, but because of possibility. the kind of possibility that hadn't existed before. Old evidence was pulled from storage, boxes reopened, labels rechecked. Inside, the past waited quietly, unchanged, untouched. Technicians handled each piece carefully. Gloves, sterile tools, controlled environments, every movement deliberate, because this wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a second chance. They extracted what they could. Tiny traces, invisible fragments left behind by someone who never expected to be found. Skin cells,
partial DNA.
Enough to begin building a profile. Incomplete, imperfect, but not useless. This time, they didn't stop at known suspects. They expanded the search. Databases had grown. Genetic information now stretched across networks, public, private, voluntary. People submitting DNA for ancestry, for curiosity, never imagining it could connect them to something darker. The search began. Slow, methodical,
complex.
Algorithms mapped connections. Analysts traced family lines. Names appeared, multiplied, branched outward. Each connection a possibility. Each possibility a step closer or further from the truth. Weeks passed. Then months. Patterns began to form. A surname repeated. A geographic overlap. Small details aligning in ways that didn't feel accidental anymore. The pool narrowed. Thousands reduced to hundreds. Hundreds to dozens. And then,
a name.
Unfamiliar, unmentioned, absent from every report, every interview, every suspect list. A ghost. But not anymore. Investigators didn't rush. They couldn't. Not after 25 years. They verified everything.
Background.
Location.
Age.
Movements. Quietly, carefully, they built a picture. And the picture started to make sense. Details that once meant nothing began to shift. A location too close to ignore. A timeline that fit too well. Small coincidences stacking until they no longer looked like coincidences at all. But they still needed proof. Because suspicion isn't evidence. And after decades of nothing, they couldn't afford to be wrong. They needed his DNA.
Direct.
Undeniable. So they waited.
Watched.
Followed from a distance. Routine mapped. Habits noted. The kind of surveillance that blends into the background, invisible unless you know where to look. The opportunity came quietly. A discarded item. Something touched, used, abandoned without thought. The kind of thing people leave behind every day without realizing what it contains. They collected it.
Sent it to the lab.
And then they waited again. Because everything now depended on a match. Because if the DNA aligned, if the profile from 1998 matched the sample taken 25 years later, then the silence would break. And the truth, buried for decades, would finally surface. Somewhere out there, a man lived his life. Ordinary, unremarkable, unaware, or maybe fully aware, that something from his past had never truly disappeared. Because time doesn't erase evidence. It just hides it. And now, after 25 years, the case wasn't cold anymore. It was awake. The lab didn't rush the result. They couldn't. Too much time had passed. Too many failures had come before this moment. Every previous lead had dissolved under scrutiny. Every theory collapsed when tested against reality. This was different. It had to be. Inside a sterile room lit by a cold, unwavering white, technicians moved with quiet precision.
No guastidmotion.
No unnecessary words. The sample, small, almost insignificant, sat sealed in a transparent container. A fragment of skin. A trace left behind decades earlier by someone who never imagined it would still exist. The past preserved at a molecular level. Machines hummed softly, their rhythm steady, indifferent to the weight of what they were processing. Data streamed across monitors. Sequences aligned, broke apart, reformed. Patterns emerging where once there had been only noise. The comparison began. Profile against profile. 1998 against now. For a moment, there was nothing. Just numbers. Just code. The kind of silence that stretches too long, that presses against your chest until breathing feels heavier. Then the alignment tightened. Markers matched. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just one then another. Enough to suggest something real. Enough to demand a second pass. A third. Verification layered over verification, because this couldn't be a mistake. It wasn't. The probability narrowed. Sharpened. Locked into place with a precision that left no room for doubt. A match. Not partial. Not speculative.
Direct.
The kind of confirmation that changes everything in a single instant. Somewhere, 25 years collapsed into one moment. The report was printed without ceremony.
No dramatic pause. No announcement.
Just a document, black text on white paper, stating what had just happened in language stripped of emotion. But the people reading it felt everything.
Shock.
Relief. Disbelief. And something else. A quiet, unsettling realization. This meant he had been out there the entire time. Living. Moving.
Aging. Free.
The name moved quickly after that. From the lab to the investigators. From investigators to supervisors. Within hours, a case that had been dormant for decades was alive with urgency again.
Vonnisgang.
Files reopened. Old evidence re-examined under a new light. The man, now no longer a ghost, had a history. Not the kind that draws attention. Not the kind that would have triggered alarms back in 1998. He had lived carefully, quietly, the kind of life that blends into the background, unnoticed, unremarkable. Which made it worse. Because it meant he had never needed to run. Detectives built the timeline again, but this time it was different. This time, they had a focal point. A center to build around instead of a void to circle endlessly. His location in 1998.
Close.
Closer than anyone had ever realized. He had been within range, within reach, within the invisible boundary of the crime scene that had once seemed so random, so disconnected. Now it wasn't. Now it looked intentional. They traced his movements forward through the years. Job records, addresses, relationships, small details that, on their own, meant nothing, but together began to form a pattern. Not a clear one, not yet, but something that felt structured.
Contained.
Controlled. Interviews were planned but not executed. Not yet. They couldn't risk tipping him off. Not before they understood everything they could without him knowing. Because if he sensed anything, if he realized the past was catching up, he could disappear again. And this time, they might not get another chance.
Surveillance tightened. Marca vehicles.
Rotating teams. Eyes always on him, but never obvious. He moved through his routine with the same quiet consistency. Work. Home. Occasional stops. Nothing unusual. Nothing that screamed guilt. But guilt doesn't always scream. Sometimes it hides in normalcy. Sometimes it builds a life so stable, so controlled, that no one ever thinks to question it. Neighbors described him the same way. Polite.
Reserved.
Kept to himself. The kind of man you wave to, but never really know. Which made the file harder to read now. Because when investigators revisited the original witness statements, something shifted. Details that once felt vague now carried weight. A description of a man seen walking near the street that night. Height, build, posture, close enough to match. Not exact, but close enough to matter. Another witness had mentioned a car. Not the make or model, just the way it idled too long, headlights off, engine running. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it aligned too well. Piece by piece, the past began to reorganize itself. Not changing. but revealing. The question that had lingered for decades, who could have done this, was no longer abstract. It had a name. But motive still lingered in shadow. Why her? Why that night? Why that house? Investigators searched for connections, direct links, any sign that he had known her, seen her, noticed her. School records, social circles, community events. Nothing obvious surfaced, which made it more disturbing, because it suggested something else. Opportunity, randomness, or something darker. They examined his behavior over the years. Any pattern of violence, any record of complaints, any hint that this wasn't the only time. But the file stayed clean. Too clean. As if whatever happened in 1998 had been contained to that single moment. Sealed off. Never repeated, or never discovered. The possibility lingered, unspoken but heavy. What if this wasn't the only time? What if this was just the only time evidence survived? The pressure built quickly now. Internally. Externally. Cases like this don't stay quiet once movement begins. Word leaks. Rumors spread. The idea that a decades-old disappearance might finally have answers creates its own gravity. And at the center of it all was a man who still didn't know.
Yet.
The arrest couldn't wait forever. Evidence had to be assembled. Warrants prepared. Every step documented with precision. Because after 25 years, the margin for error was zero. One mistake, and the entire case could collapse again. Prosecutors reviewed everything. The DNA match, the timeline, the circumstantial alignment. Each piece tested, challenged, reinforced. Was it enough? It had to be. Because waiting longer carried its own risks. The decision came quietly.
Move.
The morning was ordinary, just like that night in 1998.
No storm.
No warning. Just another day beginning without anything to mark it as different. He stepped outside. Maybe for work, maybe for routine, maybe for nothing significant at all. And that's when they approached.
No sirens. No shouting.
Just controlled movement. Officers closing in with practiced precision. The kind of choreography built from years of training, designed to end situations before they escalate. He saw them. Of course he did. Recognition flickered, not of the officers, but of something deeper, something instinctive. The moment when the past catches up and there's nowhere left to go. They spoke.
Calm. Direct.
His name. Then the words that had waited 25 years to be said. He didn't run. Didn't fight. Didn't even ask why. And that, more than anything, unsettled them. Because innocence often reacts with confusion.
Shock.
Denial. But he stood still. As if some part of him had always known this moment would come. The cuffs clicked into place. Metal against skin. A sound that echoed louder than it should have. Because it wasn't just an arrest. It was the collapse of 25 years of silence. News spread fast. Faster than anyone expected. Within hours, cameras lined the streets outside buildings that had nothing to do with the original case, but everything to do with its aftermath. Cold case solved. DNA breakthrough. Arrest after 25 years. The headlines wrote themselves. But the reality underneath them was more complicated. Because an arrest isn't a conclusion. It's a beginning. Interrogation rooms filled with quiet tension. Detectives sat across from a man who had lived most of his adult life beyond suspicion. They laid out the evidence, carefully. Not all at once. Not aggressively. Just enough to see how he would respond. He listened.
Watched.
Measured. Every reaction noted. Every pause analyzed. The DNA. The timeline. The witnesses. each piece placed in front of him like a mirror reflecting a past he could no longer deny existed. But truth doesn't always come easily. Not after 25 years. Not when silence has had so much time to settle in. Outside, the community struggled to process it. For some, it was closure. For others, it was shock layered over old grief. The idea that the answer had been there all along, hidden, waiting, was almost harder to accept than not knowing. Because it meant something had been missed. Something small. Something that, if seen earlier, might have changed everything. The house still stood. Different paint.
Different people.
But the ground beneath it hadn't changed. The place where the last known moment occurred was still there, unchanged in ways that mattered. And now, for the first time in decades, it felt like it might finally give up its secret. But answers come at a cost. And as the investigation pushed forward, one truth became impossible to ignore. Catching him didn't mean understanding him. And understanding him might reveal something far more disturbing than anyone was prepared for. The room was smaller than most people imagined. No dramatic shadows, no one-way mirror stretching across an entire wall like in the movies. Just a table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, a recorder placed carefully between them, its red light steady and unblinking. Time moved differently inside rooms like this.
Slower.
Heavier. Every second stretched, thick with expectation. He sat with his hands folded, wrists still marked faintly where the cuffs had been. Not nervous. Not exactly calm either. Something in between. Controlled. Measured. The kind of stillness that doesn't come naturally. It's built, practiced, reinforced over years. Across from him, the detectives didn't rush. They never do when it matters most. Because silence is a tool. And right now, silence was doing the work. The recorder clicked on. A soft mechanical sound, almost insignificant. But it marked the beginning of something irreversible. His name was stated for the record.
The date. The time.
Then a pause. A long one. He looked at them. Not defiant. Not cooperative. Just watching, as if trying to understand how much they knew before deciding what he would say. They started simple. Background questions. Routine. Establishing rhythm. Letting him settle into the conversation. People reveal more when they believe nothing important has begun yet. Where he lived. Where he worked. How long he had been in the area. His answers were clean.
Precise. No hesitation.
The voice of someone who had told his own story many times before and learned how to keep it consistent. Then they shifted. The year dropped into the room like weight. A subtle change. Almost invisible. But it was there. His shoulders tightened just slightly. His eyes didn't move, but something behind them did. They asked about that summer. What he remembered. Where he spent his time. Who he knew. He answered carefully. Not evasive. Not fully open either. Just enough detail to sound cooperative. Not enough to give anything away. The detectives let him speak. Because the first version of a story is rarely the final one. Then they placed the photograph on the table. Not dramatic. Not slammed down. Just set gently between them, as if it were an ordinary piece of paper. It wasn't. It was her. Taken months before she disappeared. Smiling.
Alive.
Frozen in a moment that had no idea what was coming. He looked at it. For a fraction of a second too long. Then back at them. Do you recognize her? A simple question. The kind that can break everything. He shook his head.
No.
Flat. Immediate.
Practiced.
But denial, on its own, doesn't carry weight anymore. Not when time has passed. Not when evidence exists. So they moved forward. They talked about the neighborhood, the street, the night, slowly tightening the frame, narrowing the space where his story could exist without colliding with facts. At first, he stayed steady. But then they introduced something new. the DNA. They didn't explain it all at once. Just enough. A fragment. A hint. The idea that something from that night had survived, had been preserved, had finally been understood. His reaction was subtle. Too subtle. A shift in breathing. A blink held a fraction too long. The smallest break in the rhythm he had maintained since the moment he sat down. People imagine confessions as dramatic. Voices raised. Emotions spilling out. Most of the time, it's quieter than that. It begins with cracks. They laid it out more clearly now. The sample. The profile. The match. They watched him closely. Every muscle, every movement, the way his fingers pressed slightly into each other, then released. The way his gaze drifted, not away, but inward, as if recalculating something that had just changed. Because this was the moment. The point where denial meets reality. And one of them has to give. You were there. Not a question. A statement. Silence followed. Longer this time. The kind that fills the entire room. He didn't respond immediately. Didn't argue. Didn't deny again. Instead, he leaned back slightly, as if creating distance, not from them, but from the words themselves. 25 years collapsed into that silence. Memories long buried resurfacing whether he wanted them to or not. Outside the room, the world continued. Cars passed.
Vonnesgang.
People moved through their lives unaware that something frozen in time was beginning to thaw. Inside, everything narrowed. He finally spoke. Not loudly. Not dramatically. I don't know what you think you have. Careful, controlled, but different now. The certainty had shifted. Not gone, but weakened. The detectives didn't push. They adjusted. Because confrontation isn't always the way forward. Sometimes you let the weight of the evidence settle instead. They returned to the timeline. Walked him through it step by step. Not accusing. Not forcing. Just placing events in order. Letting the gaps become visible. 9:17 p.m. The last sighting. The car. The movement on the street. Each detail presented calmly, almost neutrally. But together, they formed something harder to ignore. Something that pointed.
Toward him.
He listened. And for the first time, there was no attempt to interrupt.
No corrections. No additions.
Just silence again, but this time, it felt different. He was thinking. Not about what to say. About what he could still deny. The difference matters. Because when someone starts calculating instead of reacting, it means the structure they built is starting to collapse. They introduced the second photograph. Not of her. Of the street. Taken the night of the search. Police lights washing over asphalt. Shadows stretched long and distorted. A place that had once been ordinary, now marked by something unseen. You lived close to here. Again, not a question. He nodded.
Slightly.
Almost reluctantly.
Yeah.
The first confirmation.
Small.
But critical. They let it sit. Then moved again. Close enough to walk. Another statement. No response this time. Just a shift. A tightening of the jaw. The kind of reaction that says more than words ever could. Because distance matters. Opportunity matters. And now, both were aligning. The room felt smaller. The air heavier. They placed the final piece on the table. The report. The one that changed everything. Numbers. Sequences. Technical language that most people wouldn't understand, but its meaning was clear. A match.
Direct.
Irrefutable. This is you. No room for interpretation. No space left for denial. He stared at the paper. Longer than before. Long enough that the silence became something else. Not absence. Presence. Because now, everything was there.
The past.
The evidence. The truth. All sitting in front of him. And for the first time, he didn't look at the detectives. He looked at the table. At his hands. At nothing. Then he exhaled.
Slow.
Controlled. But different. Because something had shifted. Not completely. Not yet. But enough. DNA can be wrong. The words came out quieter than expected. Not defiant. Not confident. More like searching. Searching for a way back. But there wasn't one. Not anymore. The detectives didn't argue. They didn't need to. Because the evidence wasn't something they had to defend. It spoke for itself. Instead, they changed direction again. Help us understand. A simple phrase. But powerful. Because it offers something denial doesn't. A way forward. He didn't respond immediately. The silence returned. But this time it wasn't defensive. It was reflective. 25 years of silence pressing in from all sides. A life built on distance from that one night. Now collapsing into a single room. A single moment. A single decision. Outside, the story was already spreading. Cold case solved. Arrest made. But inside this room, nothing was solved yet. Not really. Because answers don't come from headlines. They come from here.
From what is said.
And what isn't. He finally looked up. Not at the evidence. Not at the photographs.
At them.
And in that look, there was something new. Not fear. Not guilt. Something harder to define. Recognition. As if he understood, finally, that the past hadn't disappeared. It had waited. Patiently. Quietly. For this exact moment. But even now, with everything laid out, one truth remained just out of reach. Because knowing who is not the same as knowing why. And as the silence stretched once more, heavier than before, one question lingered in the room, unspoken but impossible to ignore. What really happened that night in 1998? And why had it taken 25 years for the truth to start surfacing? The silence didn't break all at once. It shifted. Subtle at first. Like something underneath the surface beginning to move after years of stillness. He stayed seated, hands still in front of him, but the stillness wasn't the same anymore. It wasn't control. It was pressure. 25 years had built a wall around that night. Layer after layer. Memory reshaped. Details blurred. Lies repeated enough times to feel like truth. But now, inside this room, that wall wasn't holding. It was cracking. The detectives didn't rush to fill the silence. They let it expand. Because when silence stretches long enough, people start to fill it themselves. He looked at the photograph again. Not directly. Not fully. Just enough. Her face hadn't changed. Still caught in that moment before everything disappeared. Before she became a headline. Before she became a question no one could answer. You said you didn't know her. The words were calm, even, not accusatory, just a return to something already said. He didn't answer. Instead, his jaw shifted slightly. A small movement, almost invisible, but it carried weight. Because denial requires repetition. And repetition requires strength. Strength he was starting to lose. You lived close, the detective continued. You were in the area. That night. Still nothing. The recorder's red light blinked steadily, marking every second. Every breath, every pause that stretched longer than it should. You understand what the DNA means. That finally pulled something out of him. A breath. Slower this time.
Deeper.
Not controlled, contained. It means you think I was there. Not a denial. A reframing. The kind people use when the ground beneath them shifts, but hasn't fully collapsed yet. We know you were there. Another statement.
No hesitación.
No room left to move. The silence returned, but it felt different again. Tighter. Closer. Like the space in the room had shrunk just enough to make breathing noticeable.
He leaned forward this time.
Not much. Just enough to break the posture he'd held since the beginning. I didn't plan anything. The words came out quietly. Too quietly. But they landed. Because that wasn't denial. That was something else. The detectives didn't react outwardly. They didn't interrupt. They didn't push. But something had changed. This was the first fracture that mattered. You didn't plan it, one of them repeated carefully. He shook his head.
No.
The room held that moment, suspended, balanced between what had been said and what was coming next. Then what happened? The question was simple.
Direct.
And heavier than anything before it.
He didn't answer right away.
His eyes drifted, not toward the door, not toward the walls, but inward, searching through something buried, something he had spent decades avoiding. Memory doesn't stay still. It shifts. It erodes. It rebuilds itself around what's easier to live with. But under pressure, the original shape starts to come back. I was driving. The words came slowly now, measured but no longer controlled in the same way. I saw her. A pause. Longer. She was outside. Another breath. The detectives didn't interrupt, didn't guide. They let him find the path himself, because once someone starts telling the truth, or something close to it, the worst thing you can do is steer them away from it. I didn't know who she was, he added quickly. As if that mattered. As if that changed anything. She was just there. The room stayed quiet, but the air felt heavier. Every word added weight. Every detail sharpened the outline of something that had been undefined for too long. What time? One of the detectives asked. He blinked. I don't know. A beat. Late. 9:17 p.m. The time echoed in the silence, even though no one said it out loud. You stopped. Another pause. Then a nod.
Yeah.
No hesitation this time. Because once a story starts, it pulls everything with it. Why? The question cut deeper than the others. Not about what happened. About intent. About choice. He didn't answer immediately. Because there isn't an easy answer to that. Not one that makes sense. I don't know. The words came out flat. But that wasn't entirely true. People always know something. Even if they refuse to say it. You don't know why you stopped your car, the detective said, not challenging, just restating. He shifted in his chair. I just did. Another fracture. Another piece sliding out of place. She came closer, he continued, voice lower now. She thought I needed something. The sentence hung there. Distorted. Because that's how these moments work. Misinterpretation. Assumption. A small decision that opens a door that can't be closed again. She talked to me. What did she say? I don't remember. Too fast. Too clean. Memory doesn't fail like that, not in moments like this. But the detectives didn't push that yet. Not yet. And then the question carried everything forward. He swallowed. A small movement, but noticeable. I asked her something. What? Another pause. Longer. As if choosing the words mattered, now more than ever. I don't remember exactly. The same answer. But weaker this time. Because repetition exposes cracks. She leaned in, he said suddenly, as if skipping over something. Asking what I meant. His voice shifted again. Not louder. Not emotional. Just different. Less controlled. More immediate. And then the room felt smaller again. The air tighter. Every second stretching. I grabbed her. The words landed hard. No hesitation this time. No distance.
Direct.
The first real truth spoken out loud. The detectives didn't react outwardly, but the weight in the room shifted instantly. Because now there was no going back.
How?
He closed his eyes briefly, as if the image was there whether he wanted it or not. Her arm. A beat. She tried to pull away. Of course she did. That part didn't need explanation. What did you do? The question stayed calm.
Steady.
Even as everything underneath it wasn't. I told her to get in the car. His voice had flattened again. Not defensive. Not emotional. Just detached. Like he was describing something that had happened to someone else. Did she? A pause. Then a slow shake of the head.
No.
Of course not. The detectives let the silence fill that gap. Because some answers don't need to be spoken to be understood. What happened next? The question lingered.
Heavy.
Unavoidable. He didn't answer immediately. His hands tightened slightly, fingers pressing into each other. The first visible sign of strain that couldn't be controlled anymore. She screamed. The word cut through the room.
Sharp. Clear.
Not distorted by time. Some sounds don't fade. Some stay exactly the same. I panicked. There it was. The word people use when control slips. When choice turns into reaction. When people say panic, the detective said quietly, they usually mean something happened very fast. He nodded. It did. How fast? I don't know, seconds. Seconds. That's all it takes.
To cross a line.
To change everything. What did you do? Another silence. Longer now. Because this was the part that couldn't be softened. Couldn't be reframed. I covered her mouth. The room seemed to hold its breath. She kept fighting. Of course she did. Every instinct. Every survival reflex. And then the question barely above a whisper now. Not because it needed to be louder, but because the weight of it didn't require force.
He didn't look up this time.
Didn't look at the detectives. Didn't look at the photographs. Just stared at the table. I pushed her down. The words came slower. Heavier. I didn't mean to.
He stopped.
Because that sentence doesn't finish. Not in a way that changes anything. The silence that followed was different from all the others. Not empty. Not waiting.
Full.
Filled with something that couldn't be undone. What happened after that? The final question. The one that everything had been leading toward.
He didn't answer right away.
Because this was the point where the truth stopped being something he could manage. And became something he had to face. 25 years of silence pressing down into one moment. One answer. One reality. And when he finally spoke again, his voice wasn't controlled anymore. It wasn't steady. It wasn't distant. It was something else entirely. Something closer to what had been buried all along. I think she stopped moving. The words barely there. But they didn't need to be louder. Because in that moment, the case wasn't a mystery anymore. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a cold file sitting in a cabinet. It was real. It had always been real. And now, for the first time in 25 years, the truth had started to surface. Not all at once. Not completely. But enough. Enough to change everything. And still not enough to explain why. The words didn't echo when he said them. They didn't need to. I think she stopped moving. That was it.
No dramatic collapse. No tears.
No confession that spilled out in a flood of emotion. Just a sentence, unfinished in its own way, hanging in the air like something fragile that could break if anyone touched it too hard. But it was enough. Because in that moment, the case shifted. Not officially. Not on paper yet. But inside that room, inside the quiet space between what had been unknown and what was now beginning to take shape, everything changed. The detectives didn't speak immediately. They let the silence settle. Because this wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something worse, the reconstruction. The slow, precise unraveling of a night that had been reduced to fragments, now being forced back into a sequence that made sense. Or tried to. You think, one of them said finally, voice steady, careful.
He didn't answer right away.
His hands were still on the table, but no longer still. Fingers pressing, releasing, pressing again. The rhythm uneven now. The control slipping. I don't remember everything. That was the first retreat. Not denial. Not yet. But distance. Memory has edges. It protects itself. Especially when what lies beyond those edges is something a person has spent years refusing to face. But the detectives didn't accept the distance. Not after this. You remember enough, the other one said quietly. A pause. Then, start from when she stopped moving. The instruction wasn't forceful. It didn't need to be. The weight behind it did the work. He inhaled slowly.
Held it.
Let it out. I froze. A beat. I didn't know what to do. The words came in fragments now. Not smooth. Not controlled. Each one pulled up from somewhere deeper than before. She was just there.
There.
On the ground. On the pavement. On the thin line between what had been a normal night and something that would never be normal again. I thought she would get up, he added quickly, almost defensively. As if that mattered. As if expectation could rewrite what had already happened. But she didn't. The silence stretched again. This time heavier. Because now there was no ambiguity left in the direction this was going. What did you do next? The question didn't rush him. It didn't need to. He swallowed. Looked down. I think I checked. For what? A pause. Breathing. The word landed harder than it should have. Because it implied something else. Understanding. Awareness. He knew something was wrong. Not later. Not after. Right then. And he shook his head slowly. I couldn't tell. Another fracture. Another attempt to soften what couldn't be softened. Because uncertainty feels safer than certainty. But uncertainty doesn't hold under pressure. She wasn't moving, the detective said, not accusing, just stating. He didn't argue. Didn't correct. Which was its own kind of confirmation. What did you do after that? The question again. Relentless. He hesitated longer this time, because this part wasn't about reaction. It was about decision. And decisions carry weight. I panicked. The word returned. But it didn't carry the same shield it had before. What does that mean? The detective pressed gently. It means I didn't think. A breath. I just acted. The room seemed to shrink again, because now they were getting closer. Closer to the part that had stayed hidden for 25 years. I moved her. There it was. The shift. From what happened to what was done after.
How?
His hands tightened again. I put her in the car. The image formed instantly. The same car that had been reported. The same detail that had once been dismissed. Now solid. Now real. You put her in the car, the detective repeated. He nodded.
Slow.
Yes. Was she alive? The question cut through everything.
Sharp. Direct.
No room to move around it. He froze. Not physically. But something inside him stopped. Because this was the line. The one that separates everything. I don't know. The answer came too quickly. Too easily. And that made it fragile. Because I don't know isn't a shield. Not here. Not anymore. You checked for breathing, the detective said quietly. You knew something was wrong. Silence. You put her in the car anyway. Still silence. You didn't call for help. Nothing. The weight built. Layer by layer. Until it pressed down hard enough that something had to give. I didn't know what to do, he said suddenly, the first real crack in his voice. Not loud.
Not shouting.
But different. Uncontrolled. I thought, he stopped. Because whatever he thought didn't matter now. Not after everything that followed. You thought what? The detective asked. That it would go away. The words came out barely above a whisper. And in that moment, something colder than anger settled in the room. Because that wasn't panic. That was choice. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of understanding. Not sympathy. Not forgiveness. Just clarity. What did you do after you put her in the car? The question moved forward again.
Because it had to.
He didn't answer immediately. His breathing had changed now. Less steady. More visible. I drove. A pause. Just drove. Where? I don't remember exactly. The same pattern. Distance. Vagueness. But weaker now. Because each attempt to blur the details only made the outline sharper. You left the neighborhood. A statement. He nodded. Yes. How far? I don't know, a while. Time again. Uncertain.
Elastic.
But time matters. Because time creates distance. And distance hides things. What were you thinking while you were driving? The question slowed everything down. Forced him back into the moment. Into the space he had avoided for decades. I kept looking at her. The words came out uneven. In the mirror. A beat. She wasn't moving. Of course she wasn't. What did you do then? Silence. Longer this time. Because this was the part he had never said out loud. Not once. Not in 25 years.
I pulled over.
The air in the room shifted. Heavy. Where? I don't know, somewhere dark. Of course. Places like that don't stay in memory. Not clearly. Not when the mind is trying to protect itself. What did you do when you stopped? The question hung there.
He didn't answer right away.
His hands were still now. Completely still. As if movement itself had become too much. I took her out. The words dropped slowly. One by one. She was limp. The silence that followed wasn't just heavy. It was final. Because now, the shape of the night was no longer abstract. It wasn't missing. It wasn't unknown. It was forming.
Clear.
Unavoidable. And then, the last push. The last step. He closed his eyes briefly. Just for a second. But long enough to feel it. I left her. The room didn't react. No one moved. No one spoke. Because sometimes, the worst moments don't need reaction. They just exist. Where? The question came softer now. But no less important. He shook his head. I don't remember. And this time it might have been true. Because some details fade. Not because they're small. But because they're unbearable. The detectives let the silence sit one more time.
Not as a tactic.
But because there was nowhere else to go right now. The truth had surfaced. Not completely. Not cleanly. But enough. Enough to understand what had happened. Enough to know that the girl who disappeared at 9:17 p.m. didn't vanish. She was taken. She fought. And she never came back. 25 years of questions. And now, finally, answers. But answers don't bring relief. Not like people expect. Because every answer creates something else. A new absence. A new weight. A different kind of silence. And as he sat there, staring at nothing, one thing became clear. The case was no longer a mystery. But it wasn't over. Not even close. Because now, there was one question left. One that had been buried deeper than all the others. Where had he left her? The question didn't leave the room. It stayed there, suspended, pressing down on everything that followed. Where did you leave her? He didn't answer. Not immediately. Not after a few seconds. Not even after the silence stretched long enough to feel like something physical, something you could almost touch. His eyes stayed fixed on the table, on a point that wasn't really there, as if the answer might appear if he stared long enough. But memory doesn't work like that. Not after 25 years. Not after something like this. I told you I don't remember. The words came out low, careful, but thinner than before. The certainty was gone now. What remained was something fragile, something that could collapse if pushed too hard. The detectives didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. Pressure wasn't about volume. It was about persistence. You drove. One of them said, steady measured. You left the neighborhood. You stopped somewhere. He nodded slightly. Yes. You got out of the car. Another nod. Yes. You took her with you. A pause. Then. Yes. Each confirmation closed another door. Each step forward narrowed the space where uncertainty could hide. Then you remember more than you're saying. The sentence wasn't a challenge. It was a fact. And facts are harder to avoid than accusations. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible but heavy. His shoulders dropped just a fraction, the posture of someone holding something too long and starting to feel the weight of it. It was dark, he said finally. The first detail.
Small.
But real.
No estretlits.
Just nothing. The detectives leaned in, not physically, but in attention. This was how it happened. Not in leaps. In fragments. Pieces that had to be assembled. Was it a road? A field? A neighborhood? I don't know. Too fast. Too automatic. The same pattern again. But the difference now is that every denial had less ground to stand on. You said it was dark.
No street lights.
That rules out most neighborhoods. Silence. You stopped somewhere isolated. He didn't respond. But he didn't shake his head either. And that mattered. Because silence can confirm what words refuse to. You were driving for a while, the detective continued. That means distance, not just a few blocks. I wasn't thinking about distance. The answer came sharper this time. Not defensive, just strained. I was just driving. That word again. Driving. As if movement itself could erase what was happening inside the car. As if distance could dissolve responsibility. But it couldn't. It never does. You looked in the mirror, the detective said. You said she wasn't moving. A pause. Yes. You kept driving anyway. He didn't answer. Because there wasn't an answer that changed anything. You stopped when you found somewhere you thought no one would see you. This time, he reacted. A small shift. A tightening. I didn't.
He stopped.
Because whatever came next would either confirm or contradict everything he had already said. And contradictions don't hold up. You didn't what? The question came quietly. I didn't plan it, he said again, falling back to the only thing that still felt like protection. But repetition weakens over time. Especially when the facts keep moving forward. No one said you did, the detective replied. A beat. But you made choices after that. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Because now the focus had shifted. Not to the moment of panic, but to everything that came after. What kind of place was it? The detective asked. The question stayed simple. Concrete. Something that couldn't be avoided with abstraction. He hesitated. Longer this time. Because describing a place means remembering it. And remembering it means facing it. There were trees. The words came slowly. As if pulled from somewhere deeper. Not a forest. Just trees. Another fragment. Another piece. Was there a road? Yes. Paved. A pause. Then. I think so. The uncertainty lingered. But it was thinner now. Less convincing. You pulled off the road. He nodded. Yes. How far? I don't know. Of course.
Distance again. Blurry.
Unreliable. But the direction was clear. You carried her? The question landed differently. Because it forced him back into the physical reality of that moment. Not the idea of it.
Not the memory softened by time.
The actual weight. The actual movement. His hands tightened again. Yes. The word barely audible. How far? I don't know, a few steps. A beat. Maybe more. The details were coming in pieces now. Not linear. Not complete. But real enough to build something from. What did you see? He frowned slightly. As if trying to bring the image into focus. Dirt. A pause. Grass. Another. Just open. The room stayed quiet. But the picture was forming. Not clearly. Not yet. But enough to begin understanding. You said there were trees, the detective reminded him. Yes. Close together? Spread out. They were around.
Vague.
But consistent with what little he had already said. Did you go into them? He hesitated. Then nodded. A little. How far is a little? I don't know. The same answer. But weaker now. Because the more he spoke, the less space there was for uncertainty. You left her there. Not a question. A statement. He didn't respond. But he didn't deny it either. And then you left. A pause. Then. Yes. The word hung in the air. Final. Cold. Because that was the moment everything ended for her. And everything continued for him. What did you do after that? The question moved forward again. Because understanding doesn't stop at the act. It extends beyond it. Into what comes next. I went home. The answer came quickly. Too quickly. As if he had rehearsed that part. You went home, the detective repeated. Yes. What time? I don't know. Of course. Time again. Slipping. Uncertain. But the pattern remained. What did you do when you got there? A pause. Then. Nothing. The word felt empty. Like something missing. You didn't call anyone.
No.
You didn't report anything.
No.
You didn't go back. A longer pause this time. Then.
No.
Each answer tightened the narrative. Removed possibilities. Left only what remained. You woke up the next day. Yes. You heard she was missing. Another pause. Longer. Then. Yes. And you said nothing. Silence. Not even an attempt this time. Because there was nothing left to say. The weight of that moment settled over everything. Because this wasn't just about what happened that night. It was about everything that followed. Every day. Every year. 25 years of silence. 25 years of knowing. Or, at least suspecting. And choosing not to act. You went on with your life. The statement was quiet. But it carried more weight than anything else in the room. He didn't answer. Because it was true. And truth doesn't need confirmation. The recorder continued to run. Capturing everything. Every word. Every pause. Every fragment of a story that had taken decades to surface. But one thing was still missing. One piece that refused to settle. Because somewhere isn't enough. Not for a case like this. Not for a family that had spent 25 years waiting. You need to remember, the detective said finally. Not forceful. Not demanding. Just certain. Because she's still out there. The words landed differently. Not as accusation. Not as pressure. But as reality. A reality that hadn't changed in 25 years. A reality that still needed to be faced. He closed his eyes. Just for a moment. But long enough to feel it. The weight. The memory. The place. Somewhere in the dark. Somewhere off a road. Somewhere between what he had done and what he had tried to forget. And as the silence returned once more, heavier than ever, one thing became clear. This wasn't over. Not until that place had a name. Not until somewhere became somewhere real. Because until then, The case wasn't truly solved. It was just closer than it had ever been. The word somewhere had become a wall. Not solid, not impenetrable, but wide enough, vague enough, to keep the truth just out of reach. For 25 years, it had been enough. Enough to bury the past. Enough to live a life that never had to answer for what happened in the dark. But not anymore. Inside the room, the silence had changed again. It wasn't waiting. It wasn't tactical. It was heavy with expectation, pressing down on one thing, and one thing only. Location. A place. A real place. Because without that, the story wasn't complete. Without that, the case wasn't closed. Without that, she was still missing. "You need to think about the drive," one of the detectives said, voice steady, almost quiet. "Not the end. The beginning. When you left the neighborhood." He didn't respond right away. His eyes stayed down, fixed on the table, but something behind them was moving now. Not avoidance. Not deflection.
Search.
Memory doesn't return all at once. It comes in fragments, often triggered by things that seem small, irrelevant.
A sound.
A turn. A feeling. "You said you were just driving," the detective continued, "but you were following roads, making turns, passing things." A pause. "What do you remember seeing?" He inhaled slowly.
Held it.
"Let it go." "Lights," he said finally. "The first piece." "From houses." A slight shake of the head. "No farther away." "A beat." "Like behind me." The detectives exchanged a glance. Quick, almost invisible. "You left the residential area." He nodded. "Yes." "How long were you driving before that?" "I don't know, a few minutes." "Time again." "Uncertain." "But directional." "You reached a larger road." Not a question. He hesitated. Then,
Yeah.
Another piece. "You turned onto it." A pause. "Yes." "Which direction?" "I don't know." "Of course." But the structure was forming now. From a quiet street to a larger road.
Outward. Away.
"You kept driving," the detective said, guiding but not leading. "What changed?" Silence. Then, it got darker. The words came slowly. Less houses. Another pause. More space. Open. Less populated. A transition. "Did you pass anything you remember?" the detective asked. "Signs? Buildings? Anything?" He frowned slightly, as if trying to focus on something that wouldn't quite come into view. "I think there was a gas station." The detail landed carefully.
Small.
But important. "On your side of the road?" "I don't know." "Was it open?" Another pause. "I think so." Not certainty. But not nothing. "Did you stop?"
No.
Immediate.
Clear.
Because stopping would have meant witnesses. Memory tends to hold on to moments like that. "You just passed it." "Yes." The room stayed quiet for a moment, letting that detail settle. Because details build pathways. "You continued driving after that," the detective said. "Yes." "Did the road change?" He nodded slightly. "It got narrower." Another piece. "2 lanes." "I think so." The image sharpened. A main road becoming something smaller. Less traveled. More isolated. You turned off that road, the detective said. Not asking. Building. He hesitated. Then. Yes. How many turns? I don't know. A familiar answer. But weaker now. Because the more he spoke, the less space there was for uncertainty to hide. Think about the first turn. The detective pressed gently. Was it left or right? Silence. Longer this time. Because direction anchors memory. And anchoring means commitment. Right. The word came out slow, but clear. The first solid direction. You turned right. Yes. Onto another road. A nod. Yes. What was it like? Another pause. Darker. A beat.
No lights.
The pattern continued. Further away. Further removed. You drove on that road for how long? I don't know, not long. Seconds. Minutes. Time compresses under stress. But the path was forming. You saw trees. He nodded. Yes. On both sides. I think so. The image was becoming clearer now. Not complete. But enough to recognize. You pulled off that road. A pause. Then. Yes.
How?
I just turned. Was there a path? A driveway? I don't remember. But the act itself was clear. He left the road. Intentionally. You drove into the trees. Silence. Then. A little. The same phrase. But now anchored in context. How far? I don't know, not far. Of course. Because distance becomes abstract in moments like that. What made you stop there? The question landed differently. Because it wasn't about movement. It was about decision. He didn't answer immediately. His hands tightened again. Fingers pressing into each other, then releasing. I just stopped. The same pattern. But weaker. Because nothing about that night was just anything. You chose that place. Not a question. A statement. He didn't respond. But the silence confirmed it. Because choosing is harder to deny than reacting. You said there were trees, the detective continued. Open ground.
Dirt.
Grass. Yes. You carried her into that space. A pause. Then. Yes. The word was quieter now. Heavier. Because each step forward brought the memory closer. Closer to something real. Did you see anything else? The detective asked. A fence? A structure? Water. He shook his head.
No.
Listen carefully, the detective said, voice softer now. This matters. A pause. You said it was dark, but not completely. There was something. There's always something. The room went still. Because that was true. Even in darkness, something exists. A shape.
A sound.
A reference point. Something the mind can hold on to. He closed his eyes. Just for a second. Then longer. As if shutting everything out might bring something back. The silence stretched.
Long.
Unbroken. And then, I heard something. The words came out slowly. Almost uncertain. But real. The detectives leaned in, not physically, but in attention. What? Another pause. Water. The room shifted. Subtle. But immediate. Running water? The detective asked. I think so. A beat. Like a creek. The details settled heavily. Because water changes everything. It narrows location. It shapes terrain. It holds memory in ways other things don't. You heard it before you stopped? I don't know, maybe after. Uncertain. But present. Was it loud? No, just there.
Background.
Constant. The kind of sound you don't notice until you think about it. You carried her near it? Silence. Then, I don't know. But the hesitation said more than the words. Because now, the memory wasn't empty anymore. It had shape. Trees. A narrow road. A right turn. Darkness. And water. The first real outline of a place. Not somewhere. Somewhere specific. Somewhere real. You left her there. The statement returned. He didn't answer. But he didn't deny it. Because denial had no place left to stand. You drove away. Another pause. Yes. Same way you came? I think so. The room held that moment. Because now, for the first time, the path existed. Incomplete. Fragmented. But traceable. Something that could be followed. Something that could be searched. Something that could be found. And that changed everything. Because until now, the case had been about what happened.
Now.
It was about where. And as the silence settled once more, heavier than before, one truth became impossible to ignore. The place wasn't lost. It had never been lost. It had been waiting. Buried under time. Under distance. Under 25 years of silence.
But now.
It was starting to come back. The room felt different once the word water entered it. Not louder, not brighter, just narrower, focused. Because now the story wasn't drifting anymore. It had gravity. It had direction. It had something investigators could hold on to, something that existed beyond memory, beyond the man sitting across from them. A creek. Trees. A narrow road. A right turn. The outline of a place. And once a place begins to take shape, it stops being abstract. It becomes something that can be found. The detectives didn't rush forward. They didn't flood him with questions. They slowed down instead. Because this was the fragile part, the moment where memory either sharpens or collapses back into uncertainty. You said you heard water. One of them repeated, steady, anchoring the detail.
He nodded faintly.
Yes. Not loud, not fast, just there. Another nod.
Yeah.
Think about the sound, the detective continued. Not the image, just the sound. A pause. Because sound lingers differently than sight. It doesn't require clarity. It doesn't need light. It stays in the background, unnoticed until something pulls it forward. He closed his eyes again. The silence stretched.
Long.
Controlled. You don't hear water everywhere, the detective said quietly. You hear it when you're close. A beat. You were close. His breathing shifted slightly. Not faster. But heavier. I think so. The words came slowly. As if agreeing meant accepting something he had avoided for decades. Did you cross it? The detective asked. The question changed the shape of the memory. From passive to active. He hesitated. Longer this time. Because crossing something leaves a mark in memory, a physical change, a transition. I don't remember crossing anything. Not denial. But not confirmation. You heard it while you were stopped. Another pause. Then. Yes. The first solid anchor. Not just in the distance.
Not just passing by.
At the place. The detectives let that settle. Because that meant the location wasn't just near water. It was beside it. You pulled off the road before you heard it, or after? Silence. A long one. Because this mattered. This was direction. This was sequence. I think after. The words came uncertain, but they held. You heard it, then you stopped. He nodded. Yes. The room shifted again. Subtle. But important. Because now the path wasn't just movement. It was guided. He hadn't chosen a random spot. He had chosen one with a landmark. Even if he didn't realize it at the time. You turned right, the detective said, retracing. Yes. Drove down a narrow road. Yes. Fewer houses. More trees. Yes. You kept driving until you heard water. A pause. Then. Yes. And then you stopped. The sequence was complete. Not perfect. But coherent. The first time the night had made sense in one line. The detectives didn't celebrate it, didn't acknowledge it outwardly. But internally something had shifted. Because now they could work. Now they had something real. What else do you remember about that road? The detective asked. The question stayed grounded. Concrete. He frowned slightly.
Trying.
Really trying now. I think it curved. A new detail.
Small.
But significant. Left or right? I don't know, maybe left. Uncertain. But directional. After the turn? Yes. So now. Right turn. Narrow road.
Curve. Trees.
Water. The map was building itself piece by piece. You said it wasn't far, the detective continued. After the turn. Yes. Minutes. I don't know, maybe a minute. Short distance.
Close.
Not deep into isolation. Just far enough. You didn't drive for long after that.
No.
Because you heard the water. Yes. And you stopped. Another nod. The repetition wasn't wasted. It reinforced. Locked the sequence into place. Made it harder to retreat from later. Think about the ground, the detective said. You said dirt, grass. Yes. Was it flat? A pause. Mostly. Any slope? He hesitated. Then. A little. Another piece. Subtle. But shaping. Down toward the water? Silence. Then. I think so. The room tightened. Because that mattered. Because water flows downhill. Because terrain follows patterns. And patterns lead to places. You walked toward the sound. He didn't answer. But he didn't deny it either. Because now the memory was pulling him forward whether he wanted it to or not. You carried her that way. A pause. Then. Yes. The word came out heavier than the others. Because this wasn't just about location anymore. It was about action. About what he did in that place. "What do you remember when you got closer?" the detective asked. The question slowed everything down again. Focused it. He swallowed. "I remember the ground was uneven. A beat. Rocks, maybe." Another detail.
Rook terrain.
Near water. Consistent. "Could you see the water?" "I don't know, it was dark. But you could hear it." "Yes." "Close." "Yes." The word came faster this time. More certain. Because sound doesn't lie the way memory does. It's either there, or it isn't. "You didn't go into the water." Not a question. A statement. He shook his head.
No.
"You stayed on the bank." A pause. Then, "I think so." Again, not certainty, but enough. Enough to work with. Enough to search. Enough to find. The detectives let the silence stretch again. Not because they needed more from him right now, but because they understood what had just happened. For the first time in 25 years, the place wasn't just an idea. It was forming. Real. Searchable. A location defined not by exact coordinates, but by memory. And memory, when layered like this, becomes something powerful. "You understand what this means?" the detective said quietly. He didn't answer. Didn't look up. Because he did understand.
Even if he didn't want to.
"It means we're going to find it." The words didn't carry threat. Just certainty. "It means she's not lost anymore." The silence that followed was different. Not heavy. Not oppressive. Just still. Because now the focus had shifted. From him.
To her.
From what he did. To where she was. And that changed everything. Because a case without a body is a question. But a case with a location becomes an answer. Outside the room, movement had already begun. Maps pulled. Old road layouts compared to new ones. Waterways traced.
Creeks cataloged.
Every narrow road branching out from that neighborhood analyzed, filtered, narrowed down. Technology filling in where memory couldn't. Because memory had done its part. Now it was time for the real world to catch up. "You're going to take us there," the detective said finally. Not asking. Not suggesting.
Telling.
He didn't respond. But his silence wasn't resistance anymore. It was something else. Something closer to acceptance. Because after 25 years, the place he had tried to forget was about to be found. And somewhere out there, beyond the room, beyond the roads and trees and quiet stretches of land that hadn't changed as much as people think, a creek still moved. Water still flowed. Unchanged. Unaware. Carrying the same sound it had carried that night. Waiting. And for the first time in decades, someone was finally coming back. Morning came without ceremony. No dramatic sky, no sense of significance in the air. Just pale light spreading across roads that had carried thousands of cars over the years, most of them forgotten the moment they passed. But today, those roads mattered. Today, every turn, every stretch of asphalt, every patch of land held the possibility of something that had been missing for 25 years. They didn't move fast. They couldn't. Precision mattered more than speed now. Inside the vehicle, he sat in the back, hands secured, posture rigid but not resisting. He looked out the window but not really seeing. The landscape passed by in fragments, familiar shapes, distant structures, stretches of open space that might have meant nothing before, but now carried weight. Because somewhere out there, one of those places wasn't just land. It was a memory. The convoy stayed controlled. Unmarked vehicles, coordinated movement, no flashing lights. This wasn't a spectacle. Not yet. It was a search guided by something fragile, recollection layered over time, shaped by stress, eroded by years. "You're going to guide us," one of the detectives said from the front seat, voice calm, steady. "We'll take it step by step." He didn't answer.
Didn't need to.
They started from the beginning. The neighborhood. The street. The place where it all began. It looked smaller now, quieter, the kind of place that doesn't carry its history on the surface. Houses repainted, trees grown taller, the ordinary details of life continuing without interruption. But for him, it wasn't ordinary.
It couldn't be.
Because this was the last place where everything still made sense. "Which way did you go?" The question broke the silence. He stared ahead for a moment. Then, straight. The car moved.
Slow.
Measured. Every turn documented. Every second noted. They reached the larger road. Traffic moved around them, unaware, indifferent. People on their way to work, to errands, to routines that had nothing to do with what was unfolding just a few feet away. "You turned here?" A pause. Then, yes. The first confirmation. The route was real now. Not just memory. Movement. They followed the road. The environment shifted gradually. Houses spaced farther apart. Commercial signs appearing, then disappearing. The transition from neighborhood to something more open, more exposed. "Do you remember anything here?" Silence. Then, there was something. The words came slowly. "On the right." The detectives scanned the roadside. Buildings had changed. Businesses replaced. Time had rewritten the landscape. What kind of place? "I don't know, maybe a store." A beat. Gas station. The same detail from the room. Now placed in context. They slowed the vehicle. Checked the surroundings. Modern structures stood where older ones once had. But records would fill that gap later. For now, the memory mattered.
"Keep going," the detective said.
The car moved forward. Past the point where memory had first begun to surface. Into the space where uncertainty still lingered. "Where did you turn?" The question again.
Direct.
He hesitated. Longer this time. Because now the choices narrowed. Because wrong turns mattered. Up ahead. Not precise. But not empty. They continued. Scanning. Waiting. Every intersection a possibility. Every road a question. And then,
"Here."
the word came suddenly.
Sharper.
The first moment of recognition that wasn't forced. They slowed. A right turn. The road narrower, just as he described. Less traffic. Fewer buildings. More space between everything. The environment shifted again. Subtle. But clear. This is it. A pause. Then, "I think so." Not certainty. But enough. They turned. The road stretched ahead, lined with trees that felt older, denser, more settled into the landscape. Light filtered through unevenly, breaking into patches across the pavement. "Keep going," he said quietly.
They did.
The speed dropped. Every detail mattered now. Every second recorded. "You said it curves," the detective reminded him. Yes. Where? Silence. Then, up there. A slight movement of his head. The road bent gently to the left. Not dramatic, but enough. They followed it. And the world seemed to narrow again. Fewer signs of life. More quiet. More isolation. Do you recognize this? A long pause. Then, yes. This time, the word carried more weight. More certainty. Because recognition isn't always visual. Sometimes it's something deeper. A feeling. A familiarity that doesn't need explanation. You said you didn't drive far after the turn. I didn't. Then it's close. Yes. The tension in the vehicle shifted. Subtle. But real. Because now they were close. Not abstractly. Physically. The search wasn't wide anymore. It was focused. Slow down, he said suddenly. The vehicle eased forward. Barely moving now. Here. No, a little more. The words came quicker now. Less hesitation. Because the memory was catching up. Not fully. But enough. There. He leaned forward slightly. Not much. But enough to signal something real. Stop here. The car halted. The engine idling. The world outside quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty. Just waiting. This is where you pulled off. A pause. Then. Yes. The answer landed solid. No uncertainty this time. No, I think. Just yes. They stepped out. The air felt different outside.
Still.
Unmoving. As if the place itself had been holding on to something. The road looked ordinary. Nothing marked it as significant. No signs.
No barriers.
Just a stretch of land that had existed long before and long after that night. Show us. The instruction was simple. He hesitated. For the first time since they arrived, hesitation returned. Because stepping out of a vehicle is one thing. Stepping back into a memory is something else entirely. But he moved.
Slowly.
Measured. Each step deliberate. They followed. A few feet off the road. Into the space between trees. The ground shifted underfoot.
Dirt. Grass.
Uneven. Exactly as he described.
Further, he said.
Quiet. Almost to himself. They moved deeper. Not far. Just enough. The sound came first.
Faint.
But unmistakable. Water. Moving. The detective stopped for a moment. Not because they needed to, but because it mattered. Because this was the first confirmation that existed outside his words. You hear that? One of them asked. No one needed to answer. They all did. A creak. Exactly as he said. They moved toward it. The ground sloping slightly downward. Subtle.
But there.
Matching the memory. This way. He pointed. A small movement. But definitive. They followed.
Closer now.
The sound of water clearer. More present. And then they reached it. A narrow creek. Shallow. Unremarkable at first glance. The kind of place people pass without noticing.
But here,
it wasn't just a creek. It was a marker. A point in space that connected directly to something buried in time.
he stopped.
Didn't move forward. Didn't step closer. Just stood there. This is it. The words came out low, but certain.
Noche Sebastian.
No doubt. The detectives looked around, scanning.
Processing.
The place wasn't dramatic. It didn't look like a crime scene. It looked like nothing. And that was exactly why it worked. Because places like this don't draw attention. They don't invite questions. They exist quietly. Unnoticed. For years. For decades. Where exactly? One of them asked. He pointed again. Closer to the edge of the creek. There. A single word. A single spot. And suddenly, everything narrowed to that point. Because after 25 years, after thousands of hours of searching, questioning, waiting, the place wasn't a question anymore. It was real. It had been found. And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of something else entirely. Because now, for the first time in decades, the search was about to begin for real. The place looked almost painfully ordinary. A narrow creek moving beneath a canopy of trees. Dry grass bending in the morning breeze. Patches of exposed earth scattered along the bank. No warning signs.
No marker.
Nothing that suggested this quiet piece of California had once been connected to a disappearance that haunted an entire community. For 25 years, investigators had searched for a place like this. Now they were standing in it. The suspect remained several feet behind the detectives. He stared toward the creek without speaking. His face had changed since the interrogation began. The confidence was gone. The careful answers were gone. What remained was recognition. He knew this place. And now the investigators knew it too. The search team moved in. They established a perimeter first. Every entrance and exit was documented. Photographs were taken before anyone touched the ground. The position of the creek was recorded. Trees were numbered. Soil conditions were noted. Even seemingly meaningless objects were photographed exactly where they were found. Because after 25 years, nothing was meaningless. A broken branch. A depression in the soil. A fragment of weathered material. Anything could matter. The forensic specialists arrived carrying equipment designed for a problem that did not exist in 1998. Ground-penetrating technology. Improved biological testing. Advanced soil analysis. Modern recovery techniques capable of finding traces that earlier investigators could never have detected. The first search began slowly. Grid by grid. Every section of ground was divided and documented.
No shortcuts. No assumptions.
The detectives watched from the perimeter as technicians moved carefully through the trees. The creek continued flowing beside them, indifferent to the activity. Water has no memory. People do. And somewhere beneath that ground was the possibility that 25 years of uncertainty could finally become certainty. Hours passed. Nothing. The tension began to rise. A place can feel right and still be wrong. Memory can betray. A suspect can misremember. A creek can sound like another creek. A road can change. A landscape can shift dramatically over decades. The detectives knew that. They couldn't allow themselves to believe they had found the answer simply because the suspect had pointed to it. They needed evidence. Real evidence. Evidence that could survive a courtroom. The first indication came shortly after midday. A technician stopped. Not dramatically. Just stopped. He crouched near the base of a cluster of trees. Another technician approached. They spoke quietly. Then the area was marked. The detectives moved closer. What did you find? The technician didn't answer immediately. He pointed toward the ground. There was a small irregularity in the soil. A depression. Barely visible. Something beneath the surface had disturbed the earth long ago. Maybe. Or maybe it was nothing. The team began documenting it. The soil was removed layer by layer.
Slowly. Carefully.
Every handful photographed. Every object separated. Then the first fragment appeared. Material.
Old.
Weathered. Possibly fabric. The detectives looked at one another. No one spoke. The search continued. More fragments appeared. Not enough to identify anything. Not yet. But enough to justify expanding the excavation. The area grew silent. Even the investigators seemed to move more carefully now. Because everyone understood what the possibility meant. If this was connected to the missing woman, the case would change forever. Another hour passed. Then another discovery. A small object embedded beneath the soil. Its surface worn by years of moisture and earth. The forensic specialist carefully lifted it. The object was catalogued. Photographed. Bagged. And suddenly the scene became something it had not been minutes earlier. A potential crime scene. Not just a location. Evidence. The search expanded outward. The team followed the terrain toward the creek. They examined the slope. The roots. The areas where soil had accumulated naturally. They searched for disturbances inconsistent with the surrounding environment. And then came the discovery no one wanted to make. A section of ground near the bank appeared different. The soil was darker. More compacted. The shape was subtle. But artificial. The investigators marked it immediately. The suspect watched from behind the perimeter. His expression changed. One detective noticed. "You remember this area?" He didn't answer. "Is this where you left her?" Long silence. Then a barely audible response. "Yes." The word moved through the scene like electricity. The excavation began. This time, no one spoke unnecessarily. The tools moved carefully through the earth. Centimeter by centimeter. Layer by layer. The world seemed to shrink around that single patch of ground. The creek continued flowing. Birds moved through the trees. A vehicle passed somewhere in the distance. Ordinary life continued. But beneath the soil, 25 years of silence was beginning to break. Then something white appeared. At first, no one knew what it was. The forensic specialist stopped. Another technician joined him. They carefully cleared the surrounding soil. The shape became clearer.
Bone.
Human bone. The entire team froze. The discovery was immediately secured. No one touched anything unnecessarily. The medical examiner was contacted. The excavation expanded under controlled conditions. More remains were uncovered. The possibility that investigators had feared and hoped for was now reality. The missing woman had been here. After 25 years, she had finally been found. The news would later travel through the community with astonishing speed. But inside the perimeter, there was no celebration. Only silence. Because finding remains does not erase 25 years of grief. It doesn't return a daughter. It doesn't restore a sister. It doesn't give a family back the years they lost. It simply answers one terrible question. Where was she? Here. The forensic examination would take time. Identity had to be confirmed scientifically. Investigators could not rely on assumption, even now. Samples were collected. DNA testing was requested. And once again, the same invisible evidence that had cracked the case open would become the key to closing another door. The remains were compared with family DNA. The laboratory worked carefully.
No shortcuts. No prometuran un cement.
The result came back days later. Positive identification. The remains belonged to the woman who had disappeared in 1998. 25 years after the night she vanished, her family finally had an answer. It was devastating. And strangely, it was also a form of release. For decades, they had lived between two possibilities. Maybe she was alive. Maybe she was dead. Maybe she had been taken somewhere. Maybe she had chosen to disappear. Every birthday carried uncertainty. Every holiday carried an empty chair. Every unexpected phone call created the same impossible thought. Could this be her? Now they knew. The uncertainty was gone. But grief had a new shape. The investigation moved into its final stage. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence. The original DNA match. The suspect's statements. His connection to the area. The recovered remains. The physical evidence. The reconstructed timeline. Everything was placed together. The case that once consisted of fragments now had a narrative supported by evidence. The suspect's own words had become part of that evidence. He had admitted seeing her, admitted stopping, admitted taking her, admitted driving away, and finally, he had identified the place where investigators found her remains. The 25-year-old mystery had collapsed under the weight of modern forensic science and a confession that never should have been possible. But one question remained. Why had he lived freely for so long? Why had no one suspected him? The answer was painfully simple. In 1998, there had been no direct connection. No usable DNA match. No identified location.
No confession.
The investigation had been forced to work with fragments. And fragments are easy to lose. Technology changed that. The evidence waited. The DNA waited. The creek waited. The ground waited. And time, instead of destroying every trace, preserved just enough. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered as the arrest became national news. Cold case solved. DNA breakthrough. 25-year mystery ends. But behind those headlines was a quieter story. A family that finally knew. A detective who could finally close a file. A community that could finally stop wondering. And a woman whose name had spent 25 years attached to the word missing. Now it was attached to something else.
Found.
The suspect was taken into custody. The doors closed behind him. For the first time since 1998, he was no longer living outside the story. He was inside it. The evidence had followed him through time. The DNA had followed him. The memory had followed him. And finally, the place itself had spoken. Yet even after the arrest, one image remained impossible to shake.
The creek.
Still moving. Still making the same quiet sound it had made 25 years earlier. The trees had grown. The road had changed. People had moved on. But the water kept flowing. And perhaps that was the cruelest part of all. For 25 years, the world had changed around that place. Children grew up. Families moved away. Buildings disappeared. New roads were built. New lives replaced old ones. But beneath the surface, the truth had remained. Waiting. Not forgotten. Not erased. Just hidden. Until one DNA profile reopened a door that everyone thought had been closed forever. And when investigators finally stepped through it, they discovered that the past had never really disappeared. It had simply been waiting for someone to find it.